Welcome to Encounter, where we celebrate putting faith into action and community leaders who live out compassion, grace, and love. We're a program of the Broome County Council of Churches that addresses food insecurity through Chow and the Greater Good Grocery, provides hospital and jail ministry, builds wheelchair ramps, and assists neighbors with transportation and shopping services through Faith in Action volunteers. We invite you to the conversation. Encounter your neighbors as we learn to walk together in love and kindness. Good morning and welcome to this week's edition of Encounter. I'm your host, Jeff Kellam. I serve as the Parish Associate at the Union Presbyterian Church in Richmond. Not in Richmond. We've been talking about Richmond and my work there. It happens to be in Endicott, actually, in the Union District of Endicott. And my guest today will move toward that issue in just a moment. Today is Palm Sunday in many Christian traditions, not all, but it is the celebration of the day in which Jesus enters Jerusalem to shouts of Hosanna. It's also the beginning of Holy Week. I once preached a sermon on the three words shouted on the roller coaster of Holy Week. The first, Hosanna, and then on Friday, Crucify, and then on Easter Sunday, Alleluia. That sermon about the roller coaster was trying to think of how that up and down, the feelings of joy and then great sorrow and then joy again affect us even today as we think about Holy Week. So what was Holy Week all about? Who were the characters involved in Holy Week? We know about the trial of Jesus on that Friday, and his sentence and the crucifixion. There's a book called Killing the Messiah, and our guest today is the author of this book, subtitled The Trial and Crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. And we welcome Nathanel Andrade, who is a professor of ancient history at Binghamton University.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm just so thrilled to be here and have this conversation.
I think we can take care of that thrill in about 10 minutes.
All right. Perfect.
Yeah, so the book, Killing the Messiah, what a stunning title that grabs your attention right away. What led to the book?
Well, a swirl of factors, really. One is that I'm a Roman historian by training, and I've often worked on the Roman Middle East.
Yeah.
Right, and since ancient Judea, where Jesus lived, is in the Roman Middle East, I've always carried that interest. But I've always had a deep interest in the Gospels and wanted to understand them historically.
Yeah.
And I thought that this would be a project that would enable me to come to terms with my understanding of the Gospels as historical text. And so that was one of the main motivations there.
Right.
Yeah.
So your courses on ancient history certainly are rooted in the ancient geography that we know of as from the biblical atlases that were the backs of our Bibles as we grew up. But this moves us into this the gospel accounts of this so-called Holy Week in the so-called Holy Land. Maybe we ought to start with the Gospels versus history itself.
Sure.
The Gospels are theologically twinged or rooted, perhaps, more than they are historical. How do you define or focus on the take between these two, history and gospel?
Of course. I think your framing for me is essentially the way that I think about the Gospels. I think that for people who believe there's a cosmic or theological truth, right, that truth is distinct from historical accuracy in the Gospels, right? I think a text can have a vision that carries a truth in it without necessarily being always historically correct in what it's portraying. And so for me, when I was writing the book, one of the big challenges is that the Gospels are written a bit later than when Jesus lived. They represent, from an ancient historian's viewpoint, something of a partisan perception, right? Mm-hmm. They're on Jesus' side and not that of the people who don't like him so much.
Yeah.
Right, and so we have to, when you're doing ancient history, you have to factor, for those sort of things. And so when I was approaching the Gospels, I treated them the way that I treated other ancient texts, right? probably have a general accuracy in the way they portray Jesus, but some of the particulars may not always be accurate, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. Luke is the earliest and probably the shortest and most pointed, maybe we could say. The Gospel of John is far more, I think, theological rather than historical, but so much of what we have of this coming week is rooted in John.
Right.
The long prayer of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. I often wondered who was there taking notes,
Right.
listening in on this. So the gospel writer certainly had an underlying desire to paint these pictures in a Christian way to tell the story of Jesus. But at the same time, a historian wants to look at this and say, I wonder what really happened, So walk us through a little bit of who the characters are, especially as we move toward the trial of Jesus. Who are the factions who are surrounding him?
Yeah, absolutely. And since you mentioned John and John's theology, it's helpful to start there. Because when John is assigning responsibility for Jesus' death, generally John refers to the Jews, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's important to dismiss that and to analyze the earlier Gospels to get at the various agents in Jesus' death. And for me, I think it's important to emphasize the agency of Roman authority, right? This being represented by Pontius Pilate, and municipal authority at Jerusalem, this being represented by the chief priest, right? But to talk about the rationale for their thinking of Jesus as a figure of sedition, someone who may be causing social disturbance, because I think those factors enable us to identify, say, agency in Jesus' death without, pernicious accusations or stereotypes that can be very harmful. Right. So I think it's important to go to Mark and the earliest strata of the synoptic tradition that we can get to, and really think about the individuals, right, who are involved.
Yeah. You mentioned the municipal government was kind of under the chief priests.
Right.
Well, priest is a church or religious term, and they were in charge of the city.
Right. Absolutely.
And how did that come to be?
Well, in the ancient world, very often people who are priests of temples often play a significant municipal role in their community.
Yeah.
And I think when it comes to the history of ancient Judea, the chief priests at the temple were often coordinating with what were at the time figures of government. This could be the Herodians, right, King Herod, who was set up by the Romans, or it could be a Roman prefect like Pontius Pilate. So they're essentially the figures that are working with, say, the resident Roman governor.
Yeah.
Pontius Pilate, of course, doesn't live in Jerusalem, but he's there at certain times of the year. They're coordinating with him to maintain order, to do what I like to call, lower level policing work, that sort of thing. And so they also are very important administrative figures, right, in the local geography of Jesus' Judea. And I think that's the role that they are playing when it comes to Jesus' final Passover week.
Yeah. And describe a little bit of what the perception is that Jesus is doing during this week. This Palm Sunday account, if you watch the movies about the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, you've got that wonderful film, The Gospel According to Matthew. Was it Zeffirelli, the director? And it's a very small ragtag army following Jesus in.
Right.
Not at all this great majestic parade that we see in some of the other films where the whole population is following Jesus.
Right.
In reality, how big was that crowd, you suppose?
It depends on the scholar that you ask, right? Because I think when you're looking at the gospel accounts of Jesus' final week, there are interpretations that will favor more or less what the Gospels say, or there are others that might press back and ask questions like the one that you're implying at the moment, which in this case is, if Jesus was being proclaimed as some sort of messianic figure by a massive crowd, why didn't the Romans do something right away, right? He went to the temple and he preached at least a couple days. And so I think that is in part what informs the theory that crowd might have been more modest, less noticeable, Jesus had a following, but it wasn't necessarily more visible than other people that could have had similar followings the same week.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, and so, I've also read that not only was Jesus coming into Jerusalem at the time, but there was a Roman procession into Jerusalem at the same time, and I don't recall what that was all about. I'm not a historian, but
Right.
so these forces are coming together. What do you suppose Jesus meant to do in Jerusalem that week? Did he know what was going to happen?
I think he at least could anticipate the possibility of an arrest
Yeah.
in a trial. And I think that because, in my view, even though in the Synoptic tradition, the first time he really goes to Jerusalem is the last time he goes, at least implicitly. I agree with the scholarship that maintains that he had been to Jerusalem before to preach.
Yeah.
Was somewhat of a known figure to at least the local municipal authorities, in this case being the chief priest. And I think in his final week, he has something that could be considered a revolutionary message. He believes that the reign of God is coming. It's going to restore some sort of divinely appointed governance to Judea, which is not the current governance of the chief priest and of the Romans. And he's doing it at a public space, which was known for outbreaks of violence, and a lot of emotionally driven encounters. And so I think when he does that, that's really what puts him in a situation where the chief priests do want to organize an arrest and, bring him to trial before Pontius Pilate.
So it's the chief priests rather than the Roman authorities at this point.
I mean, in my book's interpretation, yes.
Yeah.
Some people will argue that it's purely the Romans,
Yeah.
right? And the issue is because for many people, since the Gospels are written a bit later, and they're written at a time in which Christians are actually receiving scrutiny from Romans, a common theory is that they're sort of shifting the desire for Jesus' death away from Roman authority and a bit more to the chief priest, right?
Yeah.
And I actually agree with that a bit. I think the Gospels, they let Pontius Pilate off a little easily, right? They sort of allow him to allow the crucifixion to happen and to sanction it while insisting that Jesus did nothing wrong in his eyes, didn't commit a crime that he could convict him of. My view is that Pontius Pilate, at least in his own mental framing, was convicting Jesus of a crime, rightly or wrongly, and the Gospels, they paper that over a bit.
Yeah, we have that common phrase, I'm going to wash my hands of this whole business.
Right.
And that's, I think, the root of that phrase, probably, where he's appears to be saying, you can do what you want to do, I'm not going to stop you, and I'll do what I have to do according to the strict law, but he didn't seem like he had his heart in it.
Precisely. And I think that it actually makes sense to surmise that Pontius Pilate had more of an investment in Jesus' death than the Gospels let on. And to shift it to the chief priest is a little too much.
There was this king thing that nobody wants somebody to pronounce themselves king or to be pronounced by their followers as a king, because Rome had a king, and thank you very much, we don't need another pretender to the throne.
Right.
Was there a tipping point during that week? Where was it the parade of the Jerusalem, or was it something else that happened that said we need to pull the plug on this?
I really think that when Jesus goes to the temple and he's preaching this messianic message, right? There's a reign of God. His rhetoric at least suggests that he's some sort of prophet, kingly figure, right? He's really setting that stage. And in particular, when he's engaging in confrontation with people in the temple precinct that he believes are not really doing the right thing at the temple, he's engaging in activity that could be viewed as inciting, rioting, civil violence, civil disturbance.
Right.
And independently of what he's intending, I think that exposes him to charges of sedition, and I think it makes Pontius Pilate partial, actually, to that type of charge. Yeah.
These days, when we think of sedition, we're thinking of January 6th.
Right.
What about, you what are the colors of sedition here? How do you look at sedition as being something that's now punishable by death?
Right. It's really complicated because I think that concept can run an array of different ways to imagine what sedition is, right? I think that type of framing could run from armed insurgency with weapons, taking over government buildings, to something as restrictive as speaking publicly in a way that can incite violence or motivate people to riot or engage in social disturbance. And part of the challenge for someone like Pontius Pilate is that there isn't like a lot of statutory language to tell him what sedition is. He kind of has to identify it when he thinks he sees it.
Yeah, right.
Which means, at least in my book, I theorize that maybe another governor doesn't convict.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Different people could just have different understandings of what qualifies as seditious.
Right.
And so the term can mean a lot of different things. And for me, what Jesus was doing could qualify for some people, for some governors, maybe not for others, but did for Pilate, right, as an individual. And that really was pivotal. Right.
So our guest today is Dr. Nathanel.
Oh, Nate is perfectly great, yeah.
Andrade, who is the author of the book called Killing the Messiah, The Trial and Crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. So if CNN were to cover this trial, what's the trial like? I mean, Jesus is hauled in. He's apparently been beaten. He stands before Pilate with this crown of thorns, we're told. And so what's going through Pilate's mind, do you suppose, at this point?
I think what's going through Pilate's mind is in part implied by the Gospels. I think it's really accurate to think of him as someone who's a careerist, who's going to do what's pragmatic for him. But at the same time, I think what's happening is that the chief priests are making the argument that Jesus is disturbing the existing social order. And it's his job, Pontius Pilate's job, really, as the prefect in Judea, to take action to maintain it. And I think that he finds the accusations persuasive, in essence.
There's no jury.
Nope. There's not.
And so do you suppose history sees this as a fair trial?
Well, the Gospels certainly do not, right? And historically, it's been thought of as a very unfair trial. And in my particular case, I'm not going to argue that it's fair or unfair, because I think the question that is addressed by the book is what was fair in the eyes of Pontius Pilate, right?
Right.
And where I distance myself from the way the Gospels depict it is that it portrays Pilate as thinking that this is unfair, but he's going to go along with it anyway. And I do think that Pilate was persuaded by the charges. And when, as the Gospel Mark, for instance, indicates that Jesus didn't really deny anything, right? The labeling King of the Jews, for example, I think largely Pilate found it easy to convict him for the charges of sedition that were being brought before him.
Jesus didn't exactly offer testimony on his own behalf to say, no, that's what they think, but he's kind of saying, who do you say that I am at that point? So the sentence of crucifixion, this seems to have been an easy way to get rid of folks finally. Were there other sentences he could have passed? And what's this crucifixion thing?
Right. It's a very, very harsh form of capital punishment. And the way that it's often discussed, and I think rightly so, is that even if you're imposing a capital sentence, crucifixion is particularly degrading and particularly cruel. In the minds of Roman jurists, the only thing that rivals it is really setting someone on fire, right? It's that awful. And I think, and I agree with many scholars who believe that for Pilate to impose such a sentence, it's difficult to imagine him just going along with what other people want.
Right.
Right. He had other options, other forms of capital punishment, for a charge of sedition that maybe he might have framed as less serious, I think he could have had Jesus lashed and then released him. And in the works of the first century Jewish historian Josephus, there are parallels for that.
Yeah.
Right? So I think that there are other possibilities. And it's even possible that other Roman governors, if Jesus had been brought before them, they acquit or they convict, but they maybe use a different punishment. Maybe they don't impose capital punishment, but they do something that they think is going to be, disciplinary and express the power of the Roman state.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, the religious community was into stoning. We know about the stoning of Stephen, the woman caught in adultery, about to be stoned.
Right.
That was another form of, it was not stoning just to hurt somebody, but to pummel them to death. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
So crucifixion leads to this symbol for Christianity as being a cross, which is an odd thing, really. It would be like the religious symbol of your tradition being a noose or an electric chair. But the cross is then transformed. In many churches, Jesus is still on the cross in the Catholic traditions, in a crucifix.
Right.
In more Protestant traditions, it's an empty cross, signaling the resurrection. So the followers of Jesus go into hiding, I guess, at this point, because they're afraid the same thing can happen to them. If they continue to preach Jesus as their king, their savior, their leader, they're open to the same kind of trial. How likely is it that they would have been rounded up?
It's certainly a possibility, and I think that's why they go into hiding.
Yeah.
Right? Whether Pilate was out to get them too is a matter of debate. Right? Maybe eliminating Jesus for him is enough.
Yeah.
But they certainly believe, and I think with some justification, that if they continue to preach in public in Jerusalem that week, right, that they are exposing themselves to a similar trial and a similar punishment. And so, yeah, they disassociate, right, quite, infamously in the case of Peter, who, according to the Gospels, actually does more than most of the other followers of Jesus. He at least is trying to figure out what's happening, right? He goes to the house of the chief priest, but even when confronted, he's like, I don't know this person, right? Yeah. And so I wouldn't be able to say whether they would have been arrested and tried, but I think that their concern that it could happen in context is a valid one, right, in real time.
I remember, it's really funny how something like this brings back a memory of one of my seminary sermons. I mean, we're talking like 150 years ago when I preached this. Don't take that literally. The sermon was based on a text that said Peter followed at a distance.
Right.
That he always put a distance there. And I guess the point of my sermon was, how closely do we follow in the footsteps of Jesus? Are we also keeping our distance too? Right. Or are we more boldly going to follow the path of light? You mentioned Josephus. Now, there are some of the agnostic or atheist category who would put themselves there, who deny that Jesus even existed. Because all we have is the sacred scriptures that Christians hold to. And they say, well, there is no historical note about Jesus. Well, Josephus has that much in the Jewish antiquities. Can you explore that a little bit?
Sure.
What does he say?
Well, Josephus makes a statement, at least as far as we can tell, that basically corroborates the outline of the Gospels, right? Jesus was an influential preacher and was crucified, right? Yeah. And it's such a controversial passage because it also seems to say that Jesus was the Messiah, and that has produced a massive debate with tons of scholarship about whether this is an authentic passage or an inauthentic passage, or a passage that's mostly authentic but maybe got reworked a bit by a Christian scribe, right, in medieval times. So it's an important testimony for many, many reasons, but in part because of this debate that you're pointing to, right? Did Jesus exist as an historical figure at all? Yeah. And a lot seems to really hinge on whether that passage is authentic or not. Though in my view, even if it's inauthentic, I think it's perfectly conceivable and likely that Jesus did exist, but for various reasons wasn't written about much until you start to get the gospel tradition anyway. But,
And once again, the Gospels were written, Mark was written, what, at perhaps 90?
I'd put closer to 70, like many scholars do.
Earlier,
Yeah.
And then probably the last of the Gospels is maybe certainly at the beginning of the 2nd century, sometime later. Probably not necessarily by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, writing in their name, which was a very common thing back then. We have letters of Paul that were not sure were written by Paul. Some certainly were, but biblical scholarship is an important thing that I think the church has overlooked in our Sunday school classes, in our preaching. We don't say very much about how the Bible came to be, or the theology behind it, or that it may not be a historical fact, but it still has truth. It's still true. And I know that for historians such as yourself, that's a difficult path to take.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
And because I think even when you ask historical questions, right, of the Gospels as ancient text, right, ancient biographical accounts of Jesus, for lack of a better way, to describe them in modern categories, people sometimes think that you're trying to dismiss whether they're valid, or you're trying to support whether they're valid in terms of the truth, right, that they contain or may contain. And for me, that's really not the purpose. My goal is really to understand them historically, independently of the cosmic truth value that they have or may have.
The book is so full of. I looked at your bibliography. I'm just overwhelmed by how you have time to write and to teach at the same time. This is true of many authors who are actively teaching. You have a teaching load and so on. But at the same time, this informs the work that you do with your students. And boy, I'd love to come to a class when you flesh this out.
You're definitely always welcome to, though I suppose the jury is out on whether I write and teach well, and devote the sufficient time to do both those things.
Yeah, I know. I can't judge your teaching. I can judge your writing. It's just a fascinating book and so well documented. I appreciate it. Our guest today on Encounter has been Nathanel Andrade, who is a professor of ancient history at Binghamton University, and we've been talking about his book, Killing the Messiah. Thank you again for joining us for this quick conversation.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Your Palm Sunday continues, and as this Holy Week now moves us toward Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and then next Sunday, Easter Sunday, Joe Selapak will be here with an Easter program for us then. The Encounter program is produced by the Broome County Council of Churches with appreciation to WBNG-TV for the facilities for recording the program and for the Town Square media stations for carrying it. I'm Jeff Kellam, hoping that in the coming week you'll be gentle with people and with yourself.